This is TLV1.
The Tel Aviv Review.
Hello and welcome to the Tel Aviv Review. I'm your host, Gilad Halpern. Today's episode is part of a series we're producing together with Israel in Depth, the podcast of the Eunice and Soraya Nazarian Center for Israel Studies at UCLA. The director of the center, Dov Waxman, is joining me again as co-host. He is professor of political science and the Rosalind and Arthur Gilbert Foundation Chair in Israel Studies at UCLA. Hello, Dov, and welcome back.
Hello, Gilad. Happy to be back.
Our guest today is a professor of political science at San Diego State University in California, where he is joining us from. He is the author of a new book entitled Jewish Self-Determination Beyond Zionism, Lessons from Hannah Arendt and Other Pariahs, that was published this year by Temple University Press. Professor Jonathan Grobart, hello and welcome to the Tel Aviv Review.
Thank you, Gilad. Happy to be here.
So your book looks at, quote, non-statist Zionism that some may regard as a contradiction in terms. I mean, like religion without God or socialism without equality. What is Zionism without a Jewish state?
Yeah, it's a great question. Look, this was a fundamental debate before there was a state of Israel. And so it was unclear if it was going to mean a separate nation state or something else. I mean, I think at heart, Zionism is about Jewish self-determination. And self-determination, right, for any peoples does not necessarily mean a state, right? Because we can't give that nation state to every peoples. So if one sort of steps back to think about what is the most just appealing way of recognizing Jewish self-determination. So my attraction to these non-statist Zionists was kind of stepping back and thinking about what is desirable about Jewish self-determination and delinking it from the need for a Jewish nation-state.
So if I can just jump in here for a moment. In presenting this idea of non-statist forms of self-determination, as I'm sure you well know, the concept of self-determination has become associated, perhaps inextricably associated in the minds of many people with statehood. So maybe it's just worth us pausing for a moment and in this concept of self-determination. I mean, are there examples that you have in mind of non-statist forms of self-determination or nations that are expressing self-determination but not in the form of having their own sovereign state?
Well, there's no shortage, say, of indigenous groups, right? We now have indigenous treaties where they're not given their own separate nation states, but they have some type of autonomy within their state. So there's including in the United States. So that element is there. These days I'm excited about, say, what's happening in northern Syria with the effort by the Kurdish-led movements in northern Syria to come up with something that's not a nation state, but a multinational federation that gives autonomy to the distinct groups. So in general, right, that this was a debate in the United Nations after World War II with decolonization, is that you couldn't give every national group its own nation state. So one had to have a broader definition of what self-determination meant. So there actually are plenty of examples. I think just the indigenous example gives you ones that cut across many parts of the world.
There are examples of nations, as you point out, that that don't have their own states. But in terms of the demand for national self-determination, it seems that many, that's a reflection of power in many ways, that nations that have the ability to have their own states as a form of self-determination would seek that. And if they're unable to get, a full state of their own, then they have to settle for kind of lesser forms of self-determination, if you will, the Kurds being, perhaps the classic example. They would like their own independent sovereign state, but short of that, they'll accept a lesser form of sovereignty. Is it possible then to convince Jews who have achieved sovereign statehood to accept less than that in the future?
And if I can jump in and maybe add on to Dov's question, why is it necessary at this moment? I mean, Israel did establish itself as a nation state. I mean, it's still prosperous and safe to an extent. Why not carry on?
All right. Yeah. So for the first part from Dub's question, I hope so. I hope it's possible, especially given the fact that you have two very well-defined national groups that have this deep attachment to all of what constitutes Israel-Palestine. So some ability to think through that it's not just one nation that has a predominant claim. So I think thinking along those lines, what the political solution would be now is, I think, needs some flexibility. So I hope this is, I mean, the reason for my book was, let's just start to think about how it would look if we recognize that both national groups have really equally strong, compelling attachments to the same
Both national
territory.
groups meaning Jews and Palestinians.
Right, yeah. Yeah, Jews and Palestinians. And so why the need? I mean, why the need to rethink it now? I think the contradictions between being a Jewish state and a democratic state are all the more acute. So starting to rethink what it means to have a Jewish self-determination within Israel, this is probably a good time. In a way, Israel is a pretty secure state, and so moving towards something that has full equality for all residents in Israel, Palestine, whatever the territorial borders become, this is a time to do it and a time to rethink what it means to be connected, right? There's no question that there's a strong Jewish self-determination attachment, just like there's no question there's a strong Palestinian attachment, self-determination. So if one starts with that premise, then various political solutions may be more palatable. Even though the current climate, right? I mean, there's nothing on the horizon that looks appealing in the current climate.
So there's been a few books that have kind of presented non-statist arguments or versions of Zionism. I can think of a book that was published back in 2010 by the historian Noam Pianko, Zionism and the Roads Not Taken, where he looked at the work of the historian Simon Radibowitz, I hope I'm pronouncing that correctly, and Mordechai Kaplan and Hans Kohn to kind of present, those thinkers, those Jewish thinkers and their argument that Zionism didn't have to seek a sovereign state. And then back in 2018, there was Dmitry Shumsky's book, Beyond the Nation State, Zionist Political Imagination from Pinsker to Ben-Gurion, which looked at a number of Zionist thinkers in the late 19th, early 20th century, Pinsker, Herzl, Hatam, Jabotinsky, Ben-Gurion, also making this argument that they had considered non-statist forms of Zionism. So there seems to be something of a trend here, and I'm wondering if you might kind of reflect on why that is. I mean, would you kind of locate your book within this broader trend of trying to maybe uncover forgotten forms of Zionism or earlier iterations of Zionism that fell by the wayside but now need to be resuscitated?
Yes, I would definitely locate my own search within those trends. I think Jacqueline Rose's book, Zion's in the title. I'm forgetting the full name of the title, but her whole thing is also recovering these alternative voices. And I think it's really since the Second Intifada and just the gloomy state of the whole 21st century is stepping back and thinking, is there another way to think about how to preserve what's exciting about Jewish self-determination without having this ugly zero-sum game? And so I think the search for kind of new ways and to look back on ideas that were fresh at one point, particularly before 1948, to revive those ideas are important.
Yeah, new and old ideas, as you point out.
Yes,
you
new and old,
focus
that's
particularly on two thinkers, Martin Buber and Hannah Arendt, who were active in the 1930s and 1940s, especially in relation to Zionism in this sense, but they were, very broad and polymath intellectuals regardless of that. With regard to alternative forms of Zionism, In what ways do you think these intellectual trends that reached their apex in the 1930s and 40s are still relevant today? I mean, back then it was a wholly different reality to what it is today.
Well, look, it has to be transposed. So I'm not calling for just going right back to the program, say that the Ikhud movement, that was the movement in the late 40s that was playing up the binationalism. It wouldn't look the same of what you would propose now in 2023. And now there's obviously a lot of history. There is a Jewish nation state. The ability to kind of define what it means is a lot harder. But on the other hand, there is this, it's certainly a moral crisis, but not just a moral crisis in terms of long-term stability. I mean, having a state of Israel that one can feel good about, excited about, a time to sort of rethink these structures, it remains imperative. So I'd say the bottom line for me is there is a need to rethink, at least conceptually, what it means to have Jewish self-determination. And then, yeah, you wouldn't go back in time to what the ideas were in 1946, but you would look to think about how can you have a political system that gives full regard to self-determination of both Jews and Palestinians.
Can you say what elements in particular in Buber's and Arendt's thought are relevant for you today?
Yeah, well, can I just interject? Yeah, I mean, in terms of Buber specifically and Hannah Arendt, what did their ideas add to our understanding, if you like, of this? You present them as humanist Zionists. In building upon those earlier books, or examining earlier Zionist thinkers and the ideas of Cohn and Kaplan and others, what do you think is the contribution of Buber and Arendt particularly to this project of kind of reimagining Zionism?
Well, one is a full reflection of what's desirable about Jewish self-determination. So to go beyond just protecting the state and to step back and think, what is it that was and is still desirable about Jewish self-determination, with renewal, with kind of ideas of justice. And so if we can step back to those foundational ones that they thought about intensely, that's one part. The second part is reckoning with how Jewish settlement upon the land displaced Palestinians, how it's marked a profound disruption. It doesn't mean going back in time and stopping that from happening, but thinking about what's the legacy, what's the negative legacy of the Jewish settlement. The next part is coming up with what would it look like and what would be a desirable Jewish self-determination for the present. And so Buber said something about universal nationalism. That's something that's linked toward a more just, more secure global community. Even for Arendt's Eichmann in Jerusalem, what she wanted about the reflections on the Nazis was not about having a Jewish nation state, but thinking about how to have a transformed international order that would make life more just and more secure, ultimately for all people. So to make this connection, to connect Jews to the welfare of other peoples. And then ultimately, and where Buber, I think, really excels, is to think seriously about affirmative coexistence. So learning intensely about each other's experiences and figuring out how to coexist. And so I think those elements are certainly in need of much greater demand. I mean, fortunately, there are elements of dialogue, of reaching out, but I think Buber in particular gives this framework of how to think about it in an intense way. And then I bring up others that follow up on the ideas of Buber.
Yeah, I'd like to know. I mean, both Arendt and Buber are the intellectual descendants of some sort of a German, Central European, perhaps, humanist tradition. And the major difference between them was actually biographical. One settled in Jerusalem, that's Buber, and the other, Arendt, was never really interested in making Aliyah or relocating to Israel or Palestine.
Right.
And I'm trying to think in what ways this was a fault line or distinguished between what they advocated for. I mean, is, for example, this notion that you just mentioned of affirmative coexistence that was promoted by Buber, do you think that it is connected to his being in Jerusalem?
Well, he had these ideas long before, right? He's in his 60s when he finally moves to that Palestine in 1938. So, I think he was faulted for not moving to Palestine earlier. But I suppose his living in Palestine and he's there still in the midst of the bloody Arab revolt of 38, and he's trying to calm down the most hardline sentiments among the Jewish community. So it does shape him. And so there's a dividing line in terms of one is more of an insider, Buber, although it's not overstated in the sense that he doesn't actually move to Palestine until 1938. So he's 60 years, right? He was born in 1878, so he's 60 years old when he moves to Palestine. Arendt, just by her disposition, she's kind of a contrarian, an outsider. Yet their bottom line is really quite close. These bottom line things of a reckoning of some kind of multinational coexistence and moving beyond what both saw as a failed nation-state model and a model that depends on the support of great powers. They're on the same page there. It's true that for Buber, the personal stakes are higher than for Arendt.
So you on the one hand, you praise their ideas in the book and argue for their relevance today, but at the same time, you don't refrain from criticizing them as well. And in particular, you critique their Eurocentrism.
Right.
If you could say something about that critique, and then maybe why you've also decided to bring in the work of Edward Said, Ella Shohat, to maybe juxtapose that with these earlier thinkers.
Yeah, so the critique came up more of Arendt. Arendt, as you know, tended to be more blunt, and so you could find private correspondence, and not always private correspondence that seems borders at least on racism, some comments. But, looking beyond more of the gotcha that we could find of a fair amount of people, it's true, and this is not really faulting them in any fundamental sense, is the experiences they drew from were European experiences. They both, and this is something I kind of realized in the course of my discovery, is that neither really knew much, say, about the Mizrahi tradition. So these were people who actually had to coexist with Arabs and Muslims for generations and generations. And for various reasons, it didn't come across their radar. And so I would say it's not so much their attitude, but their upbringing that makes them unaware that there's these other possibilities. And therefore, I'm not too hard on them. I could be harder on Arendt's more blunt statements, but they did not have a very sophisticated appreciation of either Mizrahi or Arab traditions. And so to me, it's a natural complement. So I'm not part of that group that just does the gotcha, that they're Eurocentric, and therefore to dismiss them, which I have seen among some voices, is more that, okay, we can now develop off the foundation that Buber and Arendt gave us.
And where do Edward Said and Ella Shohat and the other more contemporary and less Eurocentric thinkers come in?
Well, they come in the idea that if this is about shared history coexistence. Buber certainly, right, is very open, wants to learn all about the Arab and the Palestinian in particular tradition. From Said, right, obviously that's what he's doing, starting with what's collected in Question of Palestine is, while it's laying out Zionism, as he says, from the perspective of its victims, it is a searching effort to think about how these two peoples encountered each other. So primarily European Jews and Palestinian Arabs. And it is a search for, okay, how do we have this shared history, this reckoning that's asymmetrical over time, and that, right, the Palestinians bore the brunt of it, but that Jews also, their inspiration, in part, at least for Zionism, was the great oppression they faced, culminating in the Nazi Holocaust. So to me, Buber follows up on this tradition, follows up on this orientation of reflecting on the shared history and then thinking through, okay, how do we come up with a new form of coexistence that appreciates the attachments of both peoples? For Shofat, I mean, there's the Edward Said part, because in part she was inspired by Edward Said, but she's right of Iraqi Jewish heritage, and so it's all about, let's now think of an even more forgotten group, right? The Arab Jews, and both learn from their efforts to try to coexist and what's the turn to kind of a homogenous nation state meant. So in this case, for the Arab Jews who can now neither be welcomed by the Ashkenazi Jewish community or by the Arab community with the rise of more homogenous nation-state identity.
Other than the imperative of opening these trends of thought to more non-European thinkers, I'm trying to think whether this was also some sort of a pragmatic move on your part, because today Ashkenazi, liberal European Jews are a minority, not just in the broader Middle East, but also in Israel itself. And was that sort of an effort to make those ideas more up to date and more relevant for the contemporary reality in the Middle East?
For me, it's as I was beginning my research, I started off most excited about Buber, Arendt, and then the whole movement that was Brit Shalom, and then Ifud, which is, right, overwhelmingly European Jewish, Central and Eastern European Jewish. It was actually a student in one class of mine who's Egyptian Jewish background. He was an older student. He actually said, he was kind of skeptical of this whole idea of this binational coexistence. But he said, if you really wanted to kind of think about this, there's this people, there's a Jewish people that actually had to live for decades or centuries within the Arab lands. So it was something about their connection. And so I was not advanced on this, and so I had to learn. And so I come across Ella Shofat. It's pragmatic, I suppose, in the sense that, you certainly need to look at the Mizrahi Jewish tradition because they're a majority of Israel's Jewish population. But, the more important thing is this actually gives us more insight into thinking beyond a very narrow nation-state attachment and opening up fluid identities. So from Ella Shofat, that element of bringing in a richer sense of self-determination that's not just siloed off national groups having their own state. So ultimately, it's intellectual. Right?
So at this point in the conversation, I'm sure listeners might have got the impression that your book is really just a challenge against dominant form of Zionism, status Zionism, or kind of a hegemonic expression of Zionism. But what I found particularly interesting in it is that actually you also challenge the anti-Zionists. You also, in a sense, position yourself between, the status Zionists and the anti-Zionists. Can you say something about how you differ and how your book challenges some of those I mean, I just mentioned one, like somebody like Judith Butler, who you kind of critique, or at least their approach.
No, thank you for bringing that up. One big inspiration for the project was being frustrated by the binaries that you're either a Zionist or anti-Zionist, and depending on which ideological camp, that's a good thing or a bad thing. And so it was frustrating to me, particularly, say, among the Jewish left, is just thinking, okay, if you're a Zionist, then you're just dismissible, even if you're a, quote, liberal Zionist, unquote. And so I wanted to get some kind of richness. So I wanted to both take Jewish anti-Zionism very seriously and appreciate what it does have to offer, but also bring out the limitations. And so this book is certainly not anti-Zionist. It is anti-hegemonic Jewish nation state. And ultimately what I hope to do is get beyond the binary of are you Zionist or are you anti-Zionist, and to think about what would a desirable coexistence look like in this region.
But you do carefully avoid terming your own approach Zionist, right? You talk about, non-statist or Jewish self-determination beyond Zionism. Is that because you think the concept or the term Zionism has become kind of indelibly linked to this status form of Zionism that you refrain? You don't want to renounce Zionism altogether, but you also don't want to adopt the label.
Yes, I did struggle with that. I mean, at first I was just calling myself one of the humanist Zionists. But I think there is just a long history of Zionism being linked to a Jewish nation state. And if it's linked to a Jewish nation state, then yeah, I'd have to be anti-Zionist. But if it means Jewish self-determination, then I'm pro-Zionist. So that's why I'm just trying to, define what is it that we like, what is it that's unappealing. And like I said, maybe there has to be another term for it. Maybe it's just Jewish self-determination. I was troubled by a number of Jewish anti-Zionists that don't want to even broach the topic of Jewish self-determination, of what that would look like.
And also to recognize the Jewish attachment to the land of Israel, and that it's not just this kind of diasporic Judaism that is deterritorial. Yeah.
Right. So that just distances me from Judith Butler. Yeah.
Yeah, no, I find this all very interesting, being the only native Israeli in the room. That it strikes me as somewhat of a diasporic discussion at some point, because it does overlook or doesn't give enough weight to the fact that, unlike in the 1930s and 40s, now, 75 years on, there is a very, I'd say, a homegrown, indigenous even, sort of Israeli political identity that is quite different from the Zionism that was practiced then pre-state and perhaps today in the diaspora. And I would like to say on this that you cite two contemporary thinkers, Omri Bohm and Peter Beinart, as the current standard bearers of this political project that you advocate for. And I would like to ask you whether it's just a coincidence that they're both working and are active in the United States. Bohm is a native Israeli, but he has lived in the States and worked in the States for many years. Peter Beinart is famously non-Israeli. How do you see the Israel versus diaspora divide in all this?
I mean, it may be just I can't help a diaspora bias. But what I'm trying to do is just break down how to think about Jewish self-determination and coexistence. Maybe I didn't fully succeed, but I didn't want to make it seem like it's just like the 1940s, pre-1948, all over again. Of course, there's a long Israeli identity. I mean, I have a long section on Uri Abneri, who did, starting in the late 60s, argue that there's a separate Hebrew identity. And then, I said what was appealing, what was unappealing is he seemed to segment the Jewish identity altogether. So in a way, he was kind of the Israeli kind of
Canaanite.
just saying there's no, Canaanite.
And,
Right.
and what is also ironic is that he used to say all these things with a very thick German accent.
Right. Yeah. Right. Yeah. So in the this is one value of the Mizrahim is that they certainly have a rich tradition that's right. That's Eastern. That's Arab. And so to start thinking about how these two identities, well, in this case, how there is how the Jewish and Palestinian, but ultimately Jewish and Arab, and then when you get the Mizrahim, they both have a Jewish part within them and an Arab part. Is how to conceive of these are not these should not be diametrical opposites or enemies, but these can be a way. I mean, ultimately, it's most relevant in Israel-Palestine to think about how can we have a sort of a state that fully respects the Jewish and Arab heritage, including the complexity of both the Jewish and Arab heritage. So I guess the bottom line is it's most relevant for Israel-Palestine, not for the diaspora. I mean, I include parts about what's gone wrong, particularly with the American Jewish identity, but my bottom line is thinking about how it's going to look in Israel-Palestine. I grant I'm an outsider, and so there may be things I miss of nuances, but I am most interested in how this would look in Israel-Palestine.
So it's interesting because the solution you propose to the conflict, solution that others like Bohm and Beiner have suggested, the kind of binational political solution ultimately. But yet, one of the things that differentiates your position from theirs and other advocates of a kind of binational solution is that you don't abandon completely this idea of, in the near term, pushing for a two-state solution. Can you say something about that? That seems to be, again, just like rejecting Zionism, but also not embracing anti-Zionism, proposing binationalism, but not necessarily rejecting a two-state solution or a two-state framework as a means toward that binational solution.
Yeah, I mean, I found that frustrating, just like the Zionism versus anti-Zionism binary is, if anyone said there's anything still appealing about a two-state, that made one sound like just an apologist or just hopelessly out of touch. And I really did kind of struggle to think about, okay, what would it look like just trying to bypass altogether this idea, a state of Israel and, I say, a hoped-for state of Palestine. I just couldn't see just completely rejecting the whole criticism of Israel's occupation, the whole excitement of Palestinian self-determination. So if it was about stepping back and thinking, what is binationalism? What's the idea of binationalism? If it's two peoples having an equal claim to the same land, that is just looking, okay, so what's the political means of accomplishing this? And this was actually a conversation I had years ago with Amira Haas when I had her come in as a speaker at San Diego State in 2016. She's
the Haaretz journalist who's based in the West Bank and reporting to an Israeli audience from the Palestinian Authority.
Right. So you could say she's very much right on the left for Israeli Jews, but she was put off by any talk of binationalism. It actually surprised me a little bit, but for her it was very pragmatic. Well, it was pragmatic that the way it works in practice is trying to bypass just the reality on the ground in such a fundamental way would be unworkable. And so she thought that was kind of diaspora people, being too out of touch. And so she rebuked me a little bit for that. Even though I was never anti the two-state program, it's more just not counting on it as a fix-all for everything. But what she also told me is that, or at least she reminded me, is that the original impetus for two states, you could say, starting with Uri Avneri, It was something very exciting. It was calling for open borders and certainly full equality within Israel for the Palestinian citizens. And so it did have this progressive aspect. With the Oslo Accord, I think two-state became sort of associated with very establishment, asymmetrical. But the original two-state ideal, that's still part of the global consensus, which I've also written about, is that actually gives both a pragmatic means of making life better for Palestinians, ultimately for Israelis, but opening up possibilities for more substantive affirmative coexistence. So that's why I came out against just rejecting any kind of two-state. So that's where I'm different than, say, Ian Lustig or
That's why,
Peter Beinart.
in a way, your book can not only resurrect earlier forms of Zionism, but earlier forms of two-state advocacy as well. And
exactly.
to suggest that it's not just the Oslo framework or recent iterations of the two-state solution that might be considered.
Right, yeah. Yeah, I think there's a certain, I don't know if it's laziness or just unwillingness, say, among some on the left who see themselves as whether it's Jewish or non-Jewish, to just write off any talk of Jewish self-determination, but also any talk of two states. I think it really comes down to what is it that we want long term, and what can we use? What can we get? This says from Jewish self-determination, but also just from a very robust two-state framework that the UN continues to reassert year after year.
Okay. Professor Jonathan Grobart, author of the newly published Jewish Self-Determination Beyond Zionism, Lessons from Hannah Arendt and Other Pariahs. Thank you very much for joining us today.
Thank you very much, Gilad, and thank you very much, Dov, for your great questions.
Yes, thank you, Dov. And also many thanks to Itai Shalem, the manager of TLV1 Studios. And now we've got a request, because many or most of you listen to us on the Apple Podcasts app, and would like to ask you to please consider writing us a review. Also, please write a glowing review to Israel in Depth, the Nazarian Center's podcast. Please also support us by going to our website, that's tlv1.fm/Tel Aviv Review, and subscribing onto our Patreon campaign. Check out our archive. It has something like 800 interviews. Like us on Facebook, follow us on Twitter, and join us again next week for another edition of the Tel Aviv Review. And from us here in Tel Aviv and California, goodbye.